Buenas. Saludos, amigos, amigas, y amigues. Welcome, friends. Tonight in Tertuliando en Cuarentena, we will have I would say, a predominantly English conversation, but uh, we might have a little bit of Spanglish at some points. But I just want to kind of have that disclaimer out there. If you are joining in, to keep that in mind, and but what I do give a full wholesome guarantee is that it'll be uh, honest conversation. It'll be an intersectional conversation, and I can assure you that because that's been how this dynamic has worked out during the last 7 months. So tonight should not be the exception. So thank you for joining in. You're free to comment always, ask questions, and I try to keep that in mind. Sometimes I forget because the conversation gets so engaging, and I kind of forget that there's also other fellow humans watching and tuning in. But I have a little notification bubble, so I do, even if I get distracted, I can see it there in my corner. So welcome anyone who hasn't been here. This is a space of dialogue and intentionality, but also there's also an element of accidentality because there's things that you just don't know, and there's so much you can intend to, and then there's also the accidental element and the maybe the serendipity aspect of how just things and how that responds to how life works in many aspects. So tonight I have a good friend joining us from the U.S. It's funny when I think U.S. sometimes I forget that I am living here right now. It's kind of like a bit wishful thinking. I forget that I'm here. I think I'm somewhere else, but I'm here. So joining us from I believe the eastern part of the U.S. No sé si está in North Carolina. I'm not sure, but that's what we'll bring it on, and she'll be able to answer more of the questions. So without any further ado, I don't want to stretch out this gum and make this a super long intro. Let me bring out my friend Emily Wimbish. A ver, si esto funciona as it should, and it does.
Hi,
Bienvenida, welcome.
gracias. I am in North Carolina. You got that right.
Muy bien. So I am geographically accurate. For you,
Indeed.
for me, I forget where I am on. So gracias for joy for accepting this, which I I like to acknowledge the fact that yes, there are other tertulias that you can reference to, you can watch, but nevertheless, it's still kind of like a bit of a blindsided acceptance. It's like, oh yeah, let's do it, and that holds itself a lot of magic to it, but also a sense of uncertainty. And I can understand that for some people it could be, yeah, I feel a little bit anxious about it. Usually, and if that happens, it takes 2.5 minutes maybe to for that to dissipate. There's a anxiety timeline here that just quickly expires. Um,
Good.
Something I like to start things off here is talking about the current situation where we find ourselves in, the current pandemia situation, the current lockdown situation, the current 7 month ride that we've kind of been in, and it's evolved into that's how we live now. So I started things off with a bit of a three-legged question, and how it goes is kind of curious as to what you were doing, perhaps before this whole pandemia visited us, Emily. Early year, bring welcoming 2020, all the symbolic dynamics of welcoming a new year. We have aspirations and all things. So kind of what were you doing those first few months, and then second part is what then COVID hits. How has it been since? How did it affect those things you were doing? And how has it been all throughout these seven, now almost 8 months? And then the last part of the question, if you forget any of them, I'll remind you. Um, if you've made any observations in terms of, or just to get your observations, even if you haven't, about what this kind of has brought out in us and people living in times of pandemia. So, what were you doing? Pandemia hits. How has it been this run through? And kind of like get your take of what you read as humans and in times of pandemia.
Cool. Three-legged question. Um, so like at the turn of the year, I was in Albuquerque with my family. My parents moved to New Mexico um, earlier that year. So we all met there, right? And I remember like talking to my dad, and he was like, "Oh, there's this thing happening in China, kind of watching it, like it could be bad here, I need to get prepared for it." And I was just like, yeah, yeah, whatever. There's been like stuff that didn't make it here before, right? Um, I remember I was doing a lot of spending time. Remember I had taken several um, tarot and oracle decks with me, and I spent like a few hours just like pulling a bunch of cards to help me in my own reflections and like writing down like what are my goals for the year, what are the things I'm thinking about, what am I questioning, what am I wanting to leave behind, what am I wanting to grow in. um but I just remember I had an idea of how that was going to look, right? Like, oh yeah, I'm going to do yoga every day, like I was doing yoga with Adrian's, you know, do the whole month of January, and I started out strong with that. And like so I had really good intentions for a lot of growth. And around summer solstice, I went back and looked at all of that again and was like, okay, I can keep like I can circle back to those things. It's just looked very different from what I had expected. So I got back to North Carolina and was working and trying to figure out the year, right? And then the pandemic hit, and I actually, right when things were right before most people started paying attention and taking it seriously, I was sick. Um, there wasn't testing yet, so I don't know, and I haven't done an antibodies test, but definitely had something that was more than what I usually get with like a flu or something. So I was like, well, I'm going to quarantine myself just to be safe for everyone. And I spent a lot of time reading and was kind of one of the first people to be like, guys, I've been reading a lot of stuff. We actually need to like take this really seriously. So yeah, I don't know. Uh, the years brought me a lot of changes. Like I got the opportunity to move into a place by myself that is surprisingly within my budget. So the latter portion of my summer was like packing and moving and still in the chaos of trying to figure out what to keep and how to organize, personal stuff and art stuff. And like overall, how the year has gone, like I think that I've absolutely been going through and learning and growing in every aspect that I wrote down at the beginning of the year. It just wasn't like flowers like I thought it might be. It's been more like over and over, like, here's all the shittiest parts of yourself. Like, let's live this out a couple more times so you can really decide if you want to keep this around. And like, that's very humbling and painful. And ultimately, hopefully, means that like it really, moves through and I can move on from some of that stuff. So yeah, and then observations at large, I think um, I've been just taking in a lot of information and perspectives. And I mean, I always do that. I always try to take in perspectives from different places um, when I have the time and the emotional energy. I definitely have seen like, in the wider sphere and then in my circles, like a lot of pain and trauma and conflict created from that. Like people just uh, you know like there's not much conflict resolution happening right now because,
Mm.
and this is what I'm seeing played out in the collective, right? Is just people don't know how, like there's very serious things and very valid things that need to be worked out, and like it's just tough to see sometimes things where it's like, if people could just like communicate and have better communication skills, like, and understand their own needs and be able to come together with that, then like, if we all just knew how to practice nonviolent communication in an authentic way where you like aren't manipulating someone with it but actually care, then like we would be a lot further along, but that's not where most people are. So it's been a lot of like seeing a lot of pain and being like, oh well, I can only control myself, and like I'm still learning a lot of things about myself. So let me just keep coming back to the quote that I've really been liking, tend to the part of the garden you can touch. And that's the mantra I keep coming back to. Tend to the part of the
Hmm.
garden I can touch. I can deal with me. I can deal with my stuff. I can deal with how I react to the world. So yeah.
It's funny you mentioned this kind of metaphor of using a garden to. I mean, it could be very much taken literally, but to expand this meaning. And I don't know if you had the opportunity to hear, or if if Pepe Mujica, the former president of Uruguay, who has been just a formidable and remarkable figure all throughout history, and also with his presidency in Uruguay and what he did. Some people calling him one of the humblest people on the living planet. And he just recently retired from politics. He's an age, and he basically quite candidly said that it's because of the COVID. His COVID has been has obligated him to retire. And then in his by speech he made before his Congress or Council in Uruguay, he says, if there's something, let's phrase it, there's something I've managed to do in my life, um, is there's been a long time since I've cultivated hate in my garden.
Mm,
I do not cultivate hate in my garden anymore. And once I learned how to do that, that has taught me so many lessons on life, And I think about our problems with communicating with one another, our problems with understanding each other, misunderstanding one another. The other day I had a good friend, my good friend Dylan from Pittsburgh, was telling me how he was, like sending out some information for voting and whatnot, and then the reception he got in one household was just aggravatingly violent.
mm,
Um, like F this, F that, F this, F that. And I'm like, I contemplate and think the amount of hatred and the amount of fear and the amount of just so much insecurity within a person's life, to be able to do that with someone you don't know, just because the perception in informatica that is hitting your head about this other human is, here is a demon, or here is the worst thing you can imagine. So therefore, I'm lashing out based on that. So how much of our perceptions of one another, which can be so eternally misguided, perpetuate that livid problem of not learning how to educate, on top of the fact the language in and of itself, and the language that we have harvested in this ecosystem, carries in itself so much assumption, so much violence, because sometimes assumption is violence. When you strap this tight rope around a person, it's basically what an assumption is sometimes. And then you lock them
mhm,
into that corner, and then they have to respond to this assumption. Right? So when we start learning how to deconstruct the way that language shapes us, because we made language, but language makes us. So how do we? And that's something I talk about here a lot, because I've been doing my deconstruction on it. And then you have the academia that can help you for that, and some friends that are sometimes worthy of calling shit that you say or do out in love to help us in that journey. Um, Emily, to get to know you a little bit more about your life pilgrimages or uh, the different venues that have shaped you all throughout your life, I like asking everyone who comes here for the first time to share what they believe are, at the very least, three moments, three episodes, three somethings, because they could be instants, they could be seasons, they could be a reference to a year that you feel were transformative, that you feel were, when you look and think back on them, you're like, yeah, this definitely happened, and this led to this, and this led to that, and I recognize this now as a transformative moment, cathartic, something of cathartic nature. So three things, tres cosas que te han transformado, three things that have you feel transformed to who you are right now.
I'm gonna think about that for a second and go grab a sweater just across the room.
Dale, dale, tranquila. All right. So, in the meantime, so anyone who is watching, you're more welcome to join in, ask any questions, make any comments. Completely free to do so. Um, so siéntanse en libertad. Feel free to do so. You can ask in Spanish as well. I'll either translate or just bring it in Spanish. It doesn't there's that freedom. But anything other than Spanish and English, can't do so much. So ahí tiene, amiga, la pregunta.
So, first thing that like really comes to mind, and I was thinking about this today after I watched a tour of a really cool home in the Basque Country. This guy like took an old church and turned it into his house. Really awesome. But I studied abroad in Pamplona, Spain, which is actually the historic capital of the Basque Country. So it's claimed by the Basque nationalists and also claimed by Spain. So I was there from 2008 to 2009, and like I wanted to get my Spanish better, right? I was international studies major at NC State, concentration Latin America, and I was like, well, I'll just go to Spain and I'll make my own kind of major that does all of the Spanish speaking countries because they did it by region. And what was sort of the unforeseen change was like having grown up super conservative evangelical in a missionary household, in this like very particular worldview with a lot of people who were super loving in my family and my community, but also this particular way of viewing the world. Getting across an ocean and diving into the life of a student abroad, which is a lot of partying. I jumped into that. It was just like I was so far away that I no longer felt constrained by the shoulds and should not that I had grown up with. So yeah, I mean, and I kind of see how that. So there's two threads of what happened. Like that was the beginning of what has been a massive struggle with alcoholism, which is one of the big things that I've really been looking at this year yet again. But it was also what opened me up to like, I can do what I want. Like, I don't have to go to church all the time. I can like stay out late. I can make out with, all the cuties from all the different countries, like all of these different things that like had constrained me. And like, when I got back to the US and was finishing my undergraduate studies, and like shortly after graduating, I got introduced to festivals and to Burns, and was just like continually having like this opening of like what life can be, what experiences made sense to me. So yeah, studying abroad was kind of the beginning of a chapter, and then after I graduated, um, sort of a continuation of that, but its own space was I got a I got a position as an AmeriCorps with Habitat for Humanity in a little town called Pittsboro, south of Chapel Hill. And I was working in the Family Services Department. Um, and like, I'll just be honest, undiagnosed ADD, I was terrible at that job. Like, um, there were so many things I just didn't understand how to do well, right? So there was some of that, like trying to figure out my place in the world, my place as I knew I wanted to help people and I thought nonprofits were the way to do it. And like they were such a struggle, and looking back now that I have more pieces of understanding of myself, it makes a lot more sense. But the big thing was like I was getting to work with all of these partner families. I was getting to use my Spanish skills. A lot of them were immigrant families. And going to trainings on race and poverty and like starting to really get like I'd had all these questions like, well, if I'm told that like racism doesn't exist anymore because we had the civil rights movement, but yet people are still talking about it, like that doesn't add up. So I started to get a few more answers and like a different way to explore those questions at that time. And I was continuing to go to various festivals. And around that time, I got my first serious boyfriend. I hadn't really dated at all. And the big thing in evangelical culture was and still is the purity bullshit. And virginity till marriage is like how you should have your identity and your value, and like you know misapply all of the ways that like ancient things are applied literally to modern context, which doesn't make any sense and like really fucks people's lives up. But I got my first boyfriend and was like, this doesn't really fit with what I want to do for myself. And I decided to start having sex. And like that broke my narrative of myself. I was like, well, I can't be a Christian and do this. So I took like a big step back from all of it. There's some people who get to that question and they're like, oh, I can have an understanding of God that fits this. But for me, it was just like, I need to figure out what's what. So it kind of, there are a lot of years that were kind of part of this like crazy, what do I think, what do I believe, but just like being willing to approach each thing honestly and tear down all of my beliefs if I needed to. It's an intense way to live life, but I think I did a lot of deconstructing in a lot less years than some people maybe don't even get there in their lifetime. And I've come back around to a place where like I have a completely different understanding of what divinity means, what spirituality means, approaching consciousness, and like I'm starting to like build a different approach now. So yeah. Um, can I just do two with the second one being long?
You can do a third one. There's no time limit. There's no, there's no. I'm not answering to a certain sponsorship or anything. So you're fine to, if you feel that there is another one, maybe it might not come to you upon the maybe the sense of urgency you might be putting. Hey, well, what is that third one I'm thinking? I can't think of it right now, but that's fine. I mean, you'll probably think of it as we go into the conversation, and it'll be part of it without enumerating it as the third one. So that's fine. There's it's not a rule book for people who have not had the chance to. And there's a level of privilege that comes into traveling,
Totally.
but nevertheless, it's a fact. So if you travel, you've traveled. there's no there's no not. I mean, it happened. Okay, it's not fake news. So, um, now the outcome of the travel, now that's what that's what to play out, because that's your own idiosyncrasia, your own idiosyncrasy. I think it's what it's called. It's everyone is his own universe, as similar as we are and as diverse as we can be. So, it's just like, you had this trip to España, and you could have that trip now, and it'll be a completely different experience. It's like
Mm-hmm.
completely different head over your shoulders. It's a different country, but it will factually be the same thing. So I don't think nothing is ever the same, as likely and as similar as it could be. So I focus on this because I've had the chance also to move around and to have that, acknowledging the privilege behind that. Um, Whether it's been, in Australia, Mexico, Estados Unidos, United States, Europe, um, America Central, Guatemala, El Salvador. And when you get the chance to be able to find yourself in that parenthesis of maybe a little bit of uncomfortability, that you are not home, that you are relying on another person to be kind of like your quote unquote tour guide, or your quote unquote guide to this new place, to give you a sense of, to kind of connect your unfamiliarity to the familiarity, to kind of bridge those two together. I think that what happens there, there's this space of vulnerability that makes one more, let me just put it this way, that if that sense of vulnerability could be replicated in a classroom setting, I mean, education would be magnificent, because one, it would probably rid ourselves of this whole sort of like diagonal hierarchy type education, and it'll be more of a horizontal dynamic of, we're all experiencing this sense of vulnerability, we're all partaking of it, we're all constructing it together. So there is that opportunity, and even as you shared, you were in a different mindset, but nevertheless, there are there are experiences of learning. There's no, I don't think there's a pause button to learn. I don't think there ever is a pause button to learn. Never. Even if it's not the ideal outcome, even if you might not get the best report card back, you're still learning. You're still learning and unlearning. So what do you think, focusing on that part of your life, when you are out on your own, probably for the first time, abroad, so far away from the shores of the United States. What do you think, now over a decade ago? So what do you think that did for you, in terms of, in terms of understanding understanding the world? And I'm not suggesting have a whole definitive view of the world, but to perhaps understand, like, now you have a contrast. Here things work this way, here things work a little bit this way. Even within the quote unquote party mode you're in, is there anything that you can kind of dissect and maybe, bring forth and bring out, that within all the experiences you had, that you could still kind of carry with you, in terms of maybe it was like a flip of a switch that perhaps happened? O sea, para bien
Mm-hmm.
o para mal, like for good or for bad. I mean, but it was a bit of a switch, and you might have already touched on it a bit, but I guess I'm going into more the specificity of it.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you have any
I
other
mean, I think,
experiences living abroad as well, you can also bring it forth, not just that experience in Spain.
mm, yeah. Um, I will say, like, you know, being able to travel is an immense privilege, and I know that, like, the times that I've been able to go outside the United States have taught me a lot, and I'm so grateful for those opportunities. Um, I'm thinking about an earlier experience abroad. The church I was a part of when I was at NC State had a 5-year commitment to they do spring break projects, and so I jumped in when they were partway through going to um, a town in northern Mexico across from McAllen, Texas, to build houses, not with habitat, but so actually the first time I went on that trip, I didn't think my Spanish was very good at all. And I remember like there was this one woman and her daughter who would like very patiently speak with anyone that wanted to speak. And like them and a couple of others, that was when it like clicked for me. Like, oh, even with my like high school Spanish and like 1.5 semesters of university Spanish, like I can actually communicate, and like
Mm.
if I don't know a word, I can figure out how to still describe what I need to describe. And that was actually the trip that like cemented for me, like I'm going to learn Spanish, which I'd actually forgotten about that. That was very powerful. And then the next year going back, it was like we had a much bigger group. On the way there, one of the chaperones was telling us some about like the effect that NAFTA had on just completely depleting the economy and like fucking up the local population, and like just like a little bit of history that was like a different context than we had before. And like I just remember spending that trip like in anguish, gospel through love, whatever. And I'm over here like, oh my God, you drive across and you see like lush fields turn to like barren desert, and like,
No.
here we are, a bunch of fucking college. Like, we don't know how to build a house. Like, how much money did we spend to come down here so that like we could build shitty walls that like, we didn't build the foundation. Like, local workers built that. Why aren't they just building the whole thing? It was just very like, oh, this is for, and like, the thing is, if you have like privileged people going and having their world turned around and learning, like there is value to that,
Got
like
him.
I know that the white savior mission trip thing has a lot of deep problems, and I'm not going to pretend to know the answers to that, but I do see the duality of like my life was very much impacted by that, but and at the end of the day, we built some houses, good thing, whatever, played with some kids. But I just remember really like spending a lot of time thinking. And then we got back to the hotel in McAllen. And I like walked into the hotel room and I was like, this is bigger than the house we just built, and like
Yeah.
crying. Like,
Yeah. Quite a
um,
contrast.
yeah, and like, um, but so those trips definitely like formed like my direction, and the questions I was asking. Um, in Spain, when I studied abroad, it was interesting because I got over there in 2008. It was an election year. It was when Obama got elected, right? And I
Mm,
remember
yeah.
like being one of just a few Americans and knowing enough to know that Americans aren't always well regarded abroad. Um,
True
there was a
fact.
really cool mixture of students. I had kind of picked Pamplona. I had picked a program that took me like I didn't want to go to Madrid. I didn't want to go to a big city. I wanted to be somewhere smaller. I wanted to get to know where I was going to be. Um, so I'd already made some different decisions. I mean, yeah, I partied some, but I was like really all about getting to know people and getting to know the area. And like I took some trips, but I had been advised to mostly stay where I was. So I did. I got to like I knew Pamplona, walked everywhere, knew it really, really well. They'll tell you where the best pasteleria is if it's open. Um, but so it was interesting coming over being like, oh yeah, America's terrible. I hate my country, right? But then what I actually discovered were like commonalities with other North Americans.
Mm.
Spent more time with a couple of Canadian women than like I didn't really meet other Americans until the second semester actually. There's another wave that came through. But I remember like two of my Canadian friends and then French friends that like we had all stayed with the same person at the very beginning of the trip, right? So I would visit them, and they one time they were like, "Oh yeah, Aurélie thinks it's really weird that we like wrap up everything before we put it in the fridge. Like we have to put everything in plastic." And we're like, "Oh, this is just what we do in North America." And then there's another time that I hosted people for a pizza party. It was, you know, maybe 10 people in my flat. And I'm like running around, like putting pizzas in the oven as soon as I take one out and like trying to make sure everyone's good. And someone came to me and was like, hey, so I know that this is how our culture is, but everyone is like wondering why you're not sitting down with them. So I
Ah,
let them know that that's what we do in North America.
you're the
That's how
Mary
things
Martha
work.
story.
So I just remember like this interesting experience of being like, okay, so yeah, there's problems with the way my country has done things, but culturally there are still things that like make me from there, you know. And that was just interesting to
Sure.
sit with. And I think maybe now I spend time still thinking about like some of what that means and also some of what it means to like to believe in aspects of the vision for a place, you know, to think critically about like what's actually been done. But like, you know, there's parts of the American dream that are beautiful, you know, if they could actually be applied to all people and actually like go through and
Yeah.
fix all the shit that's happened historically and like
Yeah,
so
and
it,
paper is beautiful.
right. um which doesn't mean that like anything about where we're going is the right thing, you know, like it's just it's an open thing that I think about, but like
Sure.
coming coming from that realization years ago that's like okay, like I can do my best to be the best human that I can, and also like I was raised by parents from the US, you know, in a community that was like kind of a weirder community than a lot of people, you know, in this missionary community with like people from all over the US and all over the world. So I grew up with this like bigger worldview and in some ways different blend of culture, but also, yeah, like I don't do things the same way that someone in France does them. And it's just like little silly things like I wrap every, you know, it's gonna dry out if I don't wrap it in plastic before I put it
Yeah.
in the fridge, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's silly and yet it is not. I mean, it's the how do we categorize things as to the quote unquote silly things or the trivial things or the petty things which tend to add up, tend to add up. You talking about if we talk about the focusing on that, for example, which I'm completely wholeheartedly guilty of as well. Um, the eternal use of plastic. The eternal use of plastic based upon our out of sight, out of mind dynamic. Um,
Mm,
Not in my head. I mean, not before my eyes. Not in my head. Therefore, it's not my problem. Um, because you can talk to people probably like up in the Bronx in New York that can probably speak to this. E- e- Everything that the lower areas and more flourished, prosperous parts of New York, all their garbage basically ends up in the northern area. So um, I think
mm,
that's a perfect example of how the American dream, it's only a dream for some people, and then it's only un vertedero, a garbage dump for other people. And it
mm,
can, and another thing is it could be a dream just for that few people because it is a garbage dump for other people.
right.
That itself keeps that cycle going. It isn't magic. It isn't
Totally.
like it isn't a vacuum. It happens because it is being designed to happen that way. Um, and also even more when you keep it out of sight. So you keep it hiding. You don't talk about it. And that's something I have, just very briefly, I want to share, experienced in the last year I've been here. There's a and this is generalizing, of course. I'm not saying everyone does this, but a tendency of a don't ask, don't ask, don't tell dynamic. Like, working in a school system, in a public school system that honors or exalts the, separation of church and state because they do certain things differently because of different lawsuits and stuff against the state, like, for example, the removal of prayer and stuff. That's how progress has happened. Otherwise, we would still be like praising Yahweh in schools and then without any regard of anyone other than those Christians are comfortable with that. So even those
Hmm.
things have been moved forward because of struggle. But then at the same time, there is this taboo to talk. There is this cringe-worthy tension. Elephants, we're surrounded by elephants in a room that no one wants to acknowledge. And as soon as anyone does, oh, just wait for it. You're going to be lynched. You will be lynched, and you are
Hmm.
going to be made into a crazy person. I experienced a little bit of that. I'm sure there's people who experience it even worse. And I'm like, how is this a pedagogical environment for children to feel free to enter into the infinite realm and power of learning about themselves, about life? That holy sense of curiosity is not there. It's not there. It is it is made to be assumed as there, but there's this medium-sized box. Once you start knocking on the walls, you can't knock on the wall. There's no walls, but you touch them and you'll feel them and you start knocking and it's gonna be not good. And the things that and children have that tendency of, I mean, they don't know there are walls, so they're gonna be the first ones who are gonna ask the awkward questions, which I think it's the an invitation to step out of that place. But
Hmm.
it's so guarded. So yeah, I wholly believe in the American dream in paper, but in its application, it is the American eternal nightmare for many people. Um, and I
Well, I
think
mean,
it's
it's a dream that's been, it's an ideological, you know,
mantra.
it's idea that's been put out without, as you say, acknowledging, like, well, first of all, this land was stolen and people
Starting from that,
genocide
starting
in
from
order
that
for
very
it,
big thing.
you
Yeah.
know, and like from there, what kind of conversation can we even have? Well, maybe, like maybe just take the best parts of, because idea, I don't know, sorry. I've been thinking a lot about different aspects of this, so my brain immediately goes into like 1,000 different places and it's
I know. It's
hard
like,
to
where to
decide.
start. Where do I start this exercise of dissection?
Yeah.
It's good to find yourself in conversations with other people with other cultures and stuff, because if there is that honest exchange where you can actually find yourself exchanging it. Hey, there are some things that I value about people who are from the US. And there are things. I mean, there is this sort of like innocent, naive, or even like a essence of to dream. There is this sort of like optimism. And I think that could be replicated into a good thing. I think that could be harvested. And then you step in some places like in Europe, and there's this sense of pessimism, and there's this sense of um, maybe realism, maybe the more realistic in some aspects. I remember some of my first culture shockers were customer service in Europe. It was just the worst. In contrast, of course, maybe it's just so normal, but in contrast to this pampered service we get here. But then you talk about education, then you talk about healthcare, you talk about all these things, and you're like, you know, customer service, not dying in a hospital or not dying or being properly educated. I'll sacrifice that sour, bitter moment with a healthcare, with a customer service agent. I mean, it's definitely not seems like a big priority. But if there is that honest space to converse and to have that interaction and to really learn from one another. Naturally, not necessarily like we're going to have this intentional exercise, we're going to start pointing out things, but in that experience, then you can find those virtues
Yeah.
in the space of you before you mentioned something about being you, and I'll paraphrase it, being in a healthy state of mind, or in emotionally stable or emotionally healthy. So important to recognize that, to recognize our limits, to recognize where we are walking in our paths as we interact with everyday challenge and as we interact with other people, to also know that we're not all yes men or all yes women. We have to also say no sometimes. So recognizing our limits. I want to ask you, as someone who has found a way of expressing yourself through arts plural, how can you attribute, or what attributes have you found in finding that space that has allowed you perhaps to have reflections that you feel otherwise you wouldn't have, or allow yourself to have spaces of healing, or focus perhaps in that area of healing, of finding ourselves in our limits and recognizing those, not playing Supergirl or Superboy tendencies, but recognizing our limits. So in that space of in that art spatial, en ese espacio del arte, how do you find that it has allowed you to have really important moments of perhaps healing, and pedagogical moments of learning things about yourself, things that probably are very shitty, things that are probably very remarkable, but learning nonetheless.
Hmm. I mean, how much time do you have?
Oh no, aquí no hay límite. hasta que me duerma, until I fall asleep. No.
Need longer to really. Uh, um. So like, I was listening to something today, repeating an idea that I've seen, that like being an artist, isn't how much you make or whether you make money off of it or what quality or whatever. Like being an artist is just that you can't not create. And I've heard that idea from elsewhere, over time. And it's like, I think that it makes a lot of sense. Um, I mean, making art teaches me constantly and is certainly also part of the path into healing, um, healing myself and trying to understand the world. And um, there's always this reflective process too, of like what I make, like if it's 2D art, what kind of subject matter, or if it's 3D art, how I approach um, color, form, texture, manner of installation, like um, because I'm not just making art to look at myself, I'm making art for other people to see. And,
Mm,
with the desire to sell more and more as well, but also just, if I could give everything away and still eat, I probably would. I think a lot of people who have gifts and love to share feel that way. Um, so I realized a few years ago that, I mean, there were just very clear doors closing in um, the realm of trying to have any sort of office job, any sort of nonprofit job. Like I just, now that I know more about ADHD, I understand why I was struggling, but I didn't understand why I was so bad at all of these jobs. So I decided to be an artist, and dedicated myself to whatever that path needed to look like. Been a lot of odd jobs. A lot of just trying whatever came my way. So there's been like this constant mirroring process back and forth, like just taking random opportunities and learning about art, learning about like art skills, learning about the process of making art, learning about myself through that process, learning about others, like understanding things like perfectionism. At some point I realized, oh, well, my art isn't nearly where I want it to be, but
Mm.
other people have told me that they enjoy what I make. So really, it's a form of selfishness to not share my art just because I don't think it's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which was, a helpful push to get myself to put things out there. Or like one time a few years ago, I just randomly showed up to a party some friends were having. I was like, hey, I want to come, but I'm feeling really depressed and also don't want to be around people. What if I just like bring my art project and paint there? My friend was like,
Mm.
of course you can do that. um, and just how that like launched me into a few other live painting projects and eventually into collaborations with some friends and like um, I think the constant struggle is not feeling like what I create is good enough quality. Um, and that one comes, and I'll work through that in some way, and then it'll just come back around in another way the next time. Um, yeah. The healing, there's a healing process um, to all of that. I guess what I'm thinking of too is like um, what I see in others when I share art or work with others to share even bigger art. Um, so one thing I've explored for a few years is installation art or burns primarily, which are much more conducive space to exploring more alternative forms of expression because everyone's kind of creating a same experimental playground of like we're going to do really interesting art, we're going to do really interesting social experiment, like um, kind of creating different rules and culture to experiment with, right? So had help with some friends creating this big fabric installation that has all these drapey things and I have these swirly lights and you lay under it and it looks like you're underwater. And like that was something that like I had kind of envisioned and was like, all right, let's make this happen, and received some funding for the materials and like help from friends. There's just this whole process around it. But like behind it is this like approach to creativity and that process of sort of what feels like sometimes channeling something in and just like trying to do the best you can to make it happen. And I mean, that's something, the muses that artists and creatives and poets and philosophers have talked about for a long time. Um, but like also being intentional about like what are the kinds of spaces that I want. Like I'm at this chaotic, sometimes chaotic party environment. Like I want someplace calming with pretty things I can look at and like ground into and realizing that I just kind of try to create the art that I would like or the spaces that I would like to have, and just kind of seeing who else likes that. And there's always people who do, everyone needs different things. And um, so, yeah, like this reciprocity of um, feedback, what can I do better? What can I do different? Um, what works? What do people like? What can I build on? um, really big growing experiment has been the times that I've collaborated with my friends Molly and Alexa,
Hmm.
who are both amazing humans and amazing artists who constantly inspire me. Um, and we sort of fell into this like interesting collaboration. A friend had asked us to do paintings on the sides of a thing for one of these events. And then we were like, oh, hey, well, maybe we could, do a big life painting at this birthday party. And then we were like, hey, let's apply for this art grant together. And we ended up creating, and again, lots of angels and lots of helpers like came in and helped us make this dream a reality. But we made this giant peacock installation that like glows on one side, and then we live painted these crazy flaming eyeballs on the other side at the event. And like, maybe I'll kind of wrap up this train of thought with this bit, was like how incredible that was to see. When people talk about like when you have like a beautiful idea, when you have something like that you're trying to bring into 3D reality, and you like start putting in the work to it, that like so often the doors just like open up, and that was our experience. Was there was like so much help. We kind of went into it being like, okay, we kind of know how to make this work, but we don't actually know how to construct it. So create a really detailed spreadsheet and like apply for these funds, and like we know generally what we're going to need. And we ended up like having the budget for it. And um but yeah, the really like working with other artists is very different from working alone. And I tend to work alone, partly because I like it, partly maybe because of anxiety, partly maybe because of oldest sibling control issues. Like I'm sure there's a lot of combination of things. And um it was such a refinement process. Like, and what really was my takeaway from all of that was we would get together, and if we just tried to dive in and like talk about the project, because like there was so much happening in our personal lives, the project was taking so much time, we wouldn't always be following up with each other on things. And if we didn't stop to check in about how each individual was doing and something was going on, it was like this elephant in the room. But it's like as soon as we were just like, hey, how is everybody?
Hmm.
And then the person would be like, this is what's going on in my life, like all of these
Yeah.
things that I'm dealing with. And it's like, oh, that's why they didn't pick up
Makes
those
sense.
materials or whatever. So it was just like, oh, okay, when you're, and it just began to form these relationships that deepened and deepened. And it was like, our friendships are actually the most important thing here. And seeing that as long as we put that first, which is challenging, like I know like sometimes I get very I get, I'm not always easy, and like to have friends that would meet me with grace and be like, hey, let's just have a phone conversation, like you it's okay, and um yeah, that collaborative process is very challenging but like really beautiful and rewarding. And
Yeah, I was thinking about even asking about that, but you already, I guess you read my mind. In terms of that, those contrasts of working alone, art sometimes, and art in its pragmatic form, or in its manifested form, whether it be a painting or sculpture, just to give those two as examples. It could happen alone, like just you with it or your thoughts. And I was also thinking about the value of working in collaboration with other people. So you touched on that, and also you touched on like maybe the explication or the explaining why perhaps one feels more comfortable working with one's own self, and there's the element of the angst, the anxiety, this just a the multitude number of factors could be put into play. Um, but there's so many things that make us, uh, so many things that make us, for example, anxious. I, for example, have vivid testimony of being in control. I remember the first the I think it was like the first time or the second time I smoked weed. I don't regularly smoke weed, and I was so paranoid because I could not be in control. I'm like I do not like this sensation of I cannot channel control over every one of my thoughts. Um, and I like being in control. I like maneuvering. I like kind of structuring. I mean that comes with its pros and cons, and that realm is a very big con. And then I think of anxiety, which responds to, or at least that's been kind of how I have explored it through watching many episodes of Mister Rogers, through doing therapy with my therapist when I was doing therapy, doing cognitive behavior therapy. How do I welcome my thoughts? What I mean by that, and there's thoughts that probably should not be welcomed, or probably should be welcomed and then exited, because they foment a false narrative, that
Mm-hmm.
creates anxiety. Puts you, usually they tend to put you at the protagonistic realm of life and everything, and then you start processing thoughts of other people. This is very well experienced in relationships, or in my case, it was the consumption of a relationship, the conclusion of a relationship, and those thoughts that you construct. So, how does one deal with those moments of anxiety, of realizing that, huh, I'm not in control, and I've never really been in control of another person's life. It's only been an illusion, um, and how freeing that could be. And I'm thinking about stepping out in that place, for example, and just using you as an example since you're here. Um, like to like when one does something and one is kind of like afraid, like when kind of like when one has to go to the doctor and you one knows that one needs to get a shot and you're like, I do not want to get a shot, and you're anticipating this and you're so anxious about that shot and about that injection, and then that stream of thoughts itself become far more painful than the very shot you get. So
Mm-hmm.
you start creating this horrific narrative of
And
that
then
which
you're
is going to
so
happen.
anxious that you tense up and you actually cause yourself more physical pain, probably because
And yes,
you muscled it out
in the
enough.
search of escaping that physical pain, in search
Uh,
of protecting yourself. So there is that whole going back to letting go, letting go to some things. Um, and I was thinking of art as a means of slowing down too. I was thinking of
mm,
art as a means of slowing down. What does it mean to slow down? Because anxiety comes as a result of all also those things. Of we're also sped up, and then
mm-hmm.
we, like, for example, we might have a to-do list. Like I'm now trying to manage starting a master's from a distance, working online, and also trying to keep on doing these things that I feel are very valuable. And then I can be so tempted to think, oh, I got to do this. Oh, I got to do that. And then tomorrow I got that, and I have that. And then those that's I have tomorrow, I'm already associating them negatively, like with like, oh, the class I have. How do I revisit that thought and say, well, by the way, it does not have to be a negative experience. It is not even a shot, which could be very
Mm-hmm.
legitimately interpreted as a negative experience. So, how do we get to those places? And how does art maybe help us in that space? Like to allow art to take us to that space of, huh, using that still illustration of a shot. How can I reinterpret this? How can I reinterpret this? And how much truth is there in me creating this assumption? I'm aggrandizing it, and in aggrandizing, you're putting so much inflict on yourself. Um, so how do we get to those spaces? My suggestion is, for me, man. watching Mr. Rogers has definitely helped me so much. And people think, oh, that's so nice. It's so cute. I'm like, no, it's very powerful. It is very powerful because it is a visitation to yourself, a visitation to seeing yourself because you're welcome to slow down so much that you can't escape yourself. Might seem like a scary thing. You're like, oh my god, I'm going to be there by myself. But it is a place that we need to find ourselves in. You know, I met you within the context of a festival going very specifically, uh, spiritual arts, Christian mainly, but a quite expansive, progressive, liberal, experiential type of festival. You know, I know that that has been a relevant part of your life. You know, like festivals. I would maybe take that have formed you in one way or another. You know, encountering a sense of community in those places. Um, can you share a little bit as to what you know what has it what has it been for you to journey in these spaces? Uh, I pluralize it because it has been very literally a diverse scenario, diverse scenarios for you. You know, whether it was the Wild Goose or other types of festivals. What do you feel? How has that been a university of some sorts without proper credits? Um, yeah, how do you think that that has? Well, one, let's layer it up. You know, what do you feel? What do you feel pulls you in? What do you feel attracted you to this to the colorfulness and the smells, the air, the dynamics that play out there, that you felt enticed you enough that you gave it a shot and then you participated in it. And then so you're already in it, and how do you feel that has shaped your worldview, um, and how has it shaped it? And that's it. I'm not going to overlayer a question. I don't want to overwhelm it.
Um, well, real quick, I want to touch on the tail end of the last kind of topic. Say that
Vale.
art, I think, can serve as one of many ways of, and I'm just starting to learn about, my YouTube side, but calming our, I guess it's the parasympathetic nervous system, um, and how like we have all this anxiety and like the news cycle is there to keep us worked up so that we're freaked out so that we need to buy more stuff, and like how like all these other practices can help us calm down and we're able to think better, make better decisions, our bodies function better, we're more healthy, we're able to, you know, be more mindful in how we choose to relate to others. So um I think art and a good conversation and meditation and, you know, exercise, cooking a meal, mindful. There's so many ways to access that. Um, right now, I'm exploring that as kind of the coming together point of a lot of things I'm interested in and have been drawn to. So festivals, yeah, the university with no credit, the like university of looking like I was just fucking off for several years. What uh but yeah, no, there's so, I've learned so much just from meeting so many different people, from diving into so many different volunteer roles at many different kinds of festivals. So what drew me, the first festival I went to, my roommate at the time, Ariel, who you remember probably, who also got me to the Wagoose Festival, she was like, hey, so there's this thing called Shikori. You just sign up to volunteer and show up at this time, on this day at this time. You're going to like it. I promise.
A
So
bit
I
less
showed up.
bureaucratic than universities.
So I show up and I have no idea what a festival is, and now contextually, I didn't know how acid worked. I didn't know about the Grateful Dead. I didn't know about like this whole history of like where a lot of, I knew about Woodstock, but I didn't really know about, So I show up
Hmm.
to this thing and it's like raining all weekend. Like
As it would.
tramp yeah. I'm tramping around barefoot, making friendships, dancing, and just like having such a good time. And I get to the end of the festival, and she was like, "All right, time to go home, time to go back to the real world." And I just remember being like, "But this felt like the real world to me for the first time in my life." And that was this weird like guidepost, like something about this was different from anything I had experienced and felt really true, and then she was like, hey, that same property is going to have this festival for the first time and we're going to be the rangers and you want to come help us with that. So this year would have been the 10th goose, uh and I would have been
Wow.
at all 10 of them, other than the one that happened on the West Coast, because it's
That's
really about
crazy, eh?
status, right? It's about who can win by going to the most
Of course. Please. You want to have that
festivals.
badge of those badges of honor in full
I get a
display.
trophy, right? Uh,
Of
no, but
course.
so I was very disappointed about the goose not happening. I was honestly happy this year to get a break from everything else, but I cried
Mm.
a couple times about the goose. um, so I don't know. I've been to yoga festivals. I've been to our progressive Christian spiritual justice minded festival. I've been to smaller music festivals. Been to burns, which burners get their panties in a wad if you call a burn a festival, but art event. um,
This is a better festival
and
for those who are probably not entirely familiar. How would you define it? Like, how would you describe a burn festival? Like, if you had to kind of like describe it to someone who didn't know what it was.
um, sorry, you cut out for just a second. Describe like
So,
what burn
yeah,
festivals
yeah,
are.
burn festivals. How would you
Yeah,
describe them? What
yeah,
takes
that's a good
place there?
question.
Just very
So
briefly.
yeah. The general festival context is, a temporarily built, it's mostly going to be tents of varying degrees of structural soundness, sometimes stages, um, basically a temporary village of a celebratory nature, um, exposed to the elements, to the weather, and with different like
But this is like a
particular,
burn festival.
yeah, just in general, burns and festivals are these sort of temporary
Okay.
existent, you know, coming together to celebrate together around community and different combinations of things, whether the focus is more on bands coming to play. Um,
Mm. Yeah,
with
the
a
spectacle
burn,
aspect.
yeah, with a burn, you have some differences that like people pay for the ticket to help pay for the event, but you don't actually exchange money there. There's no vendors, you can't buy
Mm.
merch, and everything that is there is brought by the people. People will fundraise or like put their own. Obviously, money still goes into it, but
Kind of like a big potluck.
um, yeah, it's got a lot more of the like carnival. You put on the show and like spectator and the entertainer, and like
Mm.
you blur the fourth wall at every possible step.
I
Um,
like that.
so so yeah, I
So
think
yeah,
I'm
continue,
most
continue. That was a
drawn.
bit of a parenthesis. Sorry.
Yeah. I think I'm most drawn to the there's just a lot. It's a lot easier to express yourself authentically at a festival or a burn. Like that's like the whole point to a large degree, is be yourself, and you can explore what that means in a way that for the most part has a lot less judgment than most of society. um I've definitely learned a lot about myself and, you know, how I want to express and who I want to be through the sort of safer spaces of festivals. um I
You know,
think what's
Emily,
cool.
just quick, just very quick. Um, I interrupted you. I totally forgot why. Keep on going. My bad. This is how things play out here. You know,
Yeah, it
go on and
works.
go on and go on. It'll come back to me.
Yeah, cool. um there's also the element of community and like people, you know, cooking meals, sitting around a campfire, sharing drinks and food and late night laughs. And I mean, you and I have shared some of these nights. I don't remember all of them because of some of what was passed around, but
Heavily
uh,
sedated in the spirit.
glory be. uh, but just the, you know, uh, there's a lot that people don't always get it right, but I see a lot at festivals where people are able to try community in a more like childlike, playful way, you know. And it's like,
Yeah,
I always thought it was very cool actually at the Wild Goose Festival, because it's a festival that, you know, to a large degree, the people who I have met who have attended over the years like don't go to other festivals. Some of them it's their first and only time they camp, you know.
yeah,
And yet this spirit of gift giving and sharing and community and like talking to people you wouldn't normally talk to, like all of these things still sprung up in and of themselves. And I think my theory is that is partly like the vulnerable space that is created by being um
true.
out camping, you
Uh huh.
know, like people get rained on, people sweat. I think that is invaluable to creating the experience, you know, and a sense of connection. I've tried a lot of art things at festivals and burns, kind of discovered what I like doing, what I think I can monetize. I mean, right now I'm like trying to figure out how to monetize my art, and it's very challenging, partly because there's things about myself that I am working to become more disciplined on so that I can manage a, you know, business side of things. But yeah, getting to experiment with what works and what doesn't and what people enjoy, as well as what I enjoy, because there are some things that I don't care if I ever monetize. I just want to be able to share them, but you know, within a certain context. And I think just I've been exposed to, just the other thing I've learned has been exposure to so many different people and experiences, from, you know, late night campfire music jams to um different kinds of talks and seminars and classes. The Wagoos Festival obviously is very intensive about that.
Yeah,
And really, people try to put themselves in front of things that will challenge them, you know, on topics such as race and class. But at like one of the burns I go to has a like learn and play focus. So they, you know, anything anyone wants to teach, they can, you know, sign up for a class slot. So you might go make like a glowing costume tale over here and then come over here and have a talk on like the nature of consent. And it's,
that's cool.
yeah, and just being exposed to people from different backgrounds with different ways of looking at the world. I mean, like so many, you know, because again, I've gone to such a diversity of types of festivals, you know, in more recent years, being exposed to like the yoga community and the like diversity of approaches there, and like exploring um, some about like what different spirituality is out there, and like seeing some of, you know, um, seeing healthy dialogue among my various communities and sometimes more angry dialogue, but I try to learn from everything that I see.
Yeah.
If someone's mad about something, I'm like, oh, let me learn about this, because if I learn more about this topic, I would like to already know what, someone says or the issues with this.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's not in vain. We're
it's
always
definitely sprung me in.
with our with that radar of learning and unlearning. If we, I guess, if we will ourselves to it. So is a valid. It's a valid circumstance to find ourselves in to to register it so. And I think that speaks as to your process, of course. That doesn't necessarily speak into the specificity of where you might be in, but it's, I mean, geographically, but where you might be in terms of where you are finding yourself in, how you conceive yourself, and to be willing to learn and unlearn, even if it's not perhaps the idealized scenario where learning might take place. But um, yeah, my reading is that it speaks a bit as to where you find yourself at, that willingness to rid of things you don't need, and egos that we don't need. There are some egos that maybe we need that kind of just help us be
Hmm.
alive, but they're
Right.
the other ones that are just full of exclamation marks and are more reactionary than transformative. But I like to now as I kind of set up a bit of a landing strip to fall on, in this close esta tertulia. I like to talk in the space of the imaginarium. I think of Eduardo Galeano y cuando comparte and shares about ideas of utopias, las utopías, as that which you pursue and follow but never attain, and then you wonder
Mm.
what then is the purpose of pursuing this unattainable, um, futile, seemingly gesture, and it's to keep on pressing forward, to keep on moving forward. So, as a question to close this tertulia, what do you find are for you those references in the horizon, those utopias in the horizon that inspire you to keep on moving, especially within the times that we are now, not just COVID, just the very specificity of the coming election, what that represent. And I'll even say coming elections for me because there's also the elections in Puerto Rico the same day.
Mm.
But what is that place for you? What are those places, those references that allow you to, in the midst of the changing times, as Bob Dylan would say, but the changing times which need to change, but sometimes the times that are not changing that need to change. Um, how do you find that reference of hope to kind of keep on moving left, right, left foot, right foot, moving forward? Yeah. So that's as a closing question. What are those utopias for you that allow you to keep on moving on, or at least hint you sourceful references to to try to move on?
I've spent some dark nights thinking about this. I mean, more pointed moments, thinking, what if we don't get there? What if we don't ever get to any of these places? What if all of this just does crumble? What if we are just headed toward the ultimate destructive options? And what if we're headed toward the great awakening and heaven on earth for everyone and utopia, and you know, there's no way to know what the outcome will be. And like taking in a lot of mindfulness stuff and spiritual stuff and like countless hours of Ram Dass talks and like lots of random things, and it's realizing that don't have to know what's going to be the outcome in order to choose to embody heaven on earth with every moment that I possibly can. And like that power that exists in realizing that I can't control the world, but I can do my best to control my mind and learn techniques to do so, and that I can choose to be grateful for the moment that I possibly can. And then I take that thought experiment, and say, okay, well, if I'm making myself a little bit less miserable by choosing how I'm going to see things, and then see if that ripples out a little bit, that's not necessarily always going to make other people happy, but a lot of times, if I'm more at peace, then the people I interact with are going to be affected by that, and I mean, it's not always straightforward either, because then I look at
Yeah.
like my goals right now, and I'm definitely in a period of kind of shutting down what I'm doing around me and like just trying to really work on myself with the goal that I'll be better able to be of service to others. But right now I'm figuring out how to be in service to my own
To
habits
yourself.
and routines and discipline, just making life work for me. But yeah, like my life is better if I choose to take that moment by moment. And I do believe that my capacity to make life better for anyone else improves. And it's not like a dumb um, optimism, it's not like blind. Like I know that things are dire. But when I
Yeah.
focus on that, when I focus on that, I can't do anything, like when I, I, I limit how much I'm on Facebook now. I don't check the news. Usually I find out about enough things when I do check Facebook. It's just like I've learned bit by bit some of how this plays out for me specifically, and that like I
Yeah.
spent a lot of my life feeling anguished and sad all the time and feeling really guilty for all of the good things that I had. And eventually it was just like feeling guilty doesn't make it to where I can help make things better for anybody else. And feeling sad
Yeah.
all the time
True.
doesn't help me be able to make things better for anyone else. So yeah. Um, how about you? What's your pieces of utopia and why you go for it?
Um, my references are when I find myself. I was about to quote the Beatles song. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me. um, and then she speaks her words of wisdom, and it's all better. Um, the I hope I don't get in trouble with copyright issues because of this.
You
Um,
changed it at the end, so it's fine.
the no, like what I wanted to say is when I find myself in this spaces and times when I realize that I don't have to be anxious. Um, when those moments happen, when there's enough perfecting conditions for that to happen, and I say that jokingly, there's never going to be like perfecting conditions, but what I mean by that is by me creating that space and that mindset of the reminder of, hey, by the way, it's good, it's okay. That there's that is not something to be anxious about. Speaking with speaking as to the specificity of whatever situation, I'm not to say that everything is grand or everything is to be interpreted like, but but especially when I put myself in a cup of water, as we say in Puerto Rico, and I drown myself in a cup of water, then that's a good time to exercise a is this a sustainable feeling for being something for being anxious about? Is this a sustainable, legitimate thing to feel anxious about? And not to feel guilty, because that's not the solution either. Not to feel guilty about feeling anxious, but to really do something about it. Because feeling anxious is not a cool thing to feel. It's not fine. It doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't make you more functional. It doesn't make whatever chemicals you got going on in your brain produce whatever you need to be in a better place mentally. It doesn't. It actually creates the very opposite. So how do I transition to that place?
Mm-hmm.
So when that happens, and I remind myself, oh, like it's just like it's rivers of joy in terms of it's just relaxation. It's just I can be a better person for me and for other people. So that for me is a sense of I find is a good reference when I find myself in those places. I'm like, aha, and I can revisit myself. I can revisit as a reference. Hey, that can be a place where you can go. You don't have to give into it. So that serves as a reference because it's all about me. It has to do with me, with things, with what I have control over. It does not rely
Mm-hmm.
on depending on other people or on their thoughts about me, on their circumstance. And there's so much of how we feed or construct ourselves that relies on the perception of others of us or the perception we have of their perception. I mean, it's just an unending little tail chase. So breaking that cycle definitely helps me harvest enough references to feel, hey, it's not something you need to resort to. Anxiety. Let's work on that. So yeah, that is my sense of utopia. Reminding myself that there are those moments where kind of like go. Yesterday I referenced the movie Field of Dreams. Don't know if you're familiar with it. The Kevin Costner film and the
It's been a while.
the ghost in the baseball field
Yeah.
where he build it, it'll come. And I was thinking about the scene where Earl Jones goes into the unknown with a smile on his face. Um, and I think when I step out of my anxiety, or when I realize it's kind of like me stepping out into the unknown with a smile on my face, not knowing what's going to happen, um, because anxiety doesn't provide the answers either. It only provides the illusion that it has the answers. So
Mm-hmm.
I refer to that scene. So yeah, definitely trying to step into that cornfield of the unknown. I'm sure any Iowan or northern midwestern people of the U.S. could be appreciative of this metaphor. um, Huskers up in Nebraska, step into the cornfield of the unknown and have a smile on your face. That is such a metaphor that I, as a Puerto Rican, cannot relate to whatsoever at all. Step into the plantain field of unknowingness from my Puerto Rican brothers and sisters and Caribbean brothers and sisters. So yeah, being in the unknowingness, I think has served as a good reference point of it's okay. It's natural. You know, the alternative is
Yeah.
unnatural. So por ahí vamos. Hasta la victoria.
In a way. Uh-huh. Sí.
Emily, so un placer haber tenido tu compañía acá. I have enjoyed this interaction and conversation so much. Thank you
Me too.
because it's
Ha
it's
sido un
therapy for
placer.
me.
Mm.
Y
Yeah. Same.
todos,
Thanks for
todos,
sharing
todas,
with me.
todas y todos, claro que sí, aquí siempre, para compartir. Todos, todas y todos, anyone who's been around, thank you so much also for being a part of this, even as a silent spectators. You know, I don't think it's in vain. I think there's that reciprocal energy always taking place, and anyone who listens to this in a recorded manner, also, I hope you find something here. And I always close with this. I always close with the words of un puertorriqueño muy conocido llamado Walter Mercado, who has a documentary on Netflix called Mucho Mucho Amor. He was a famous Puerto Rican astrologist, no sé cómo se dice. And every time he would close his segments, he would close in this remarkable way. Espero que tenga mucha paz, pero sobre todo que tenga mucho, mucho amor. And as iconic and as cliched as that phrase has become, because it's been a stamp for over 40 years perhaps, it does hold meaning. So I wish everyone had to have peace and to build that peace and harvest it. And overall things, love. Love. So, gente, gracias. No te desconectes, Emily. And we will see each other next time. So, hasta luego.
Indeed.
Ciao. Bye bye.
Legal. Bye.